Good evening. I'm Sherry Gleed. I am honored to be the Dean of NYU Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion. NYU Wagner, for those of you who don't know us, we've been around for over 75 years, and our goal is to help our students, our wonderful students, translate their passion into action so they can make an effective and lasting impact on the public good here in New York City and around the globe. Our faculty conduct, there's several of them here, they conduct research that changes the way people understand and act on the most important issues of our time. And our 11,000 alumni worldwide are applying their education in a real-world context in a variety of fields. We at Wagner pride ourselves on being a place where timely, important, relevant conversations take place, and tonight's discussion is one of those. Our moderator and panelists will discuss safety in New York City, how neighborhoods, our built environment, our social infrastructure play a significant role in making the city safe for all New Yorkers. I want to welcome our moderator, David Remnick. Hi. I didn't see you come in. And our panelists, Eric Klinenberg, Pat Sharkey, and Eric Cumberbatch. They will receive proper introductions shortly, but on behalf of NYU Wagner and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, we thank you for being part of this discussion and sharing your insights. We are live streaming this evening's event, so welcome to all of those of you online. And during tonight's program, we want to hear from you, the audience. So there are two ways you can take part in today's conversation and ask questions. First, Twitter, and second, old-fashioned index cards. For Twitter, submit a question using the hashtag #SafetyInNYC, which you will see in your programs and on the screen. The second way to ask a question is by simply writing it down on an index card if you still have that technology. And then raise your hand at any point during the discussion, and an usher will pick up your index card from you. They also have some extra index cards if you should happen not to have picked one up. So it is now my pleasure to turn the stage over to one of our esteemed visiting scholars, our resident urbanist, and partner in this event, Liz Glazer. I shouldn't say Lizzie, but that's because it dates me. All right. She is director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice and serves as the senior criminal justice policy advisor to the mayor and first deputy mayor. And she's one of the city's leading urban practitioners whose frontline work focuses on advancing the understanding of cities around the world. So we are delighted to have her here, delighted to have her as one of our distinguished visiting urbanists, and delighted to welcome her to the podium. Welcome, Liz.
Great. So thanks, Sherry, and good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here, and thanks to the Wagner School for co-hosting this event. This is actually the first in a series of events that we're entitling Safety in the 21st Century City to really explore kind of what we've learned and what we have yet to learn about creating a thriving city. Today we're going to be talking about a whole series of questions, but sort of centrally whether safety can be produced only by cops and by the justice system, or whether safety is something more than the absence of crime. And we'll take a look at, as Sherry said, neighborhood residents, physical infrastructure, and a whole bunch of other things with our panelists and our moderator. In the next panel in May, I just want to do a quick advertisement. We'll look at the role of fairness in creating safety. It sounds pretty gauzy, but actually it's quite concrete. Particularly in our post-Garner, post-Ferguson, post-Baton Rouge world, the issue of how we create trust between police and neighborhoods is really foundational. And the question is whether or not fairness can be as sharp and as tangible as DNA testing. And we'll have another standout panel with a leading theoretician on legitimacy, practitioners from backgrounds in engineering, policing and the arts, who have literally made these concepts of fairness concrete. So I was going to give just the tips of the waves kind of context for tonight's panel. This is a story that we in New York never tire of telling, but it's really pretty extraordinary, the steepness, the durability, and the length of our drops in both crime and incarceration. Just to give you sort of a sense, last year there were fewer than 300 murders in our city. That was the amount of murders that a single precinct In fact, many single precincts experienced in 1990 when murders topped over 2,200. And it's not just that long arc of history over the past couple of decades, but we're actually seeing changes in front of our eyes, some changes that I think the panelists tonight will talk about what those causes are. And just to sort of give you a sense of that, we've started to look at a different kind of measure of safety, which is how many days do we in New York go without a single shooting in the day in New York. I'm not going to do improv theater and make people guess, but just to give you a sense, 4 years ago, we went for 26 days, not consecutively, but 26 separate days where there was not a single shooting in the city of New York. Last year, that doubled to 54. This year, we are on the rise even from that. And it's not just crime that's down, it's incarceration as well. Our jails today hold about a third what they did in 1991. We're not as good as Tokyo or London or Paris, but New York City today has the lowest incarceration rate of any big city in the US. And as crime and incarceration has come down, so has enforcement, how much the police actually use their touch to create peace. And there's been a remarkable lightening of the touch. We've seen it in stop and frisk, which has gone down from a height of almost 800,000 stop and frisks a year to about 10,000 last year. Arrests, summonses, by any measure, it's down, down, down. But for all that good news, there's also a kind of insidious inequality and a durability of place in the measure of safety in our city. Of the precincts that led the city in shootings in the early 1990s when we had our heights of violence, 7 of them are the same today. And they're familiar names. It's Brownsville and East New York and Bed-Stuy and so on. And to be sure, the numbers are remarkably lower. Brownsville had 30 shootings last year. That's what the Upper West Side had in the early 90s, just to give you a sense. And it's down from about 300. But still, the neighborhoods where violence concentrates in the city are the same places where we see low birth rates, high asthma, low educational achievement, high unemployment. And in this most highly segregated city, the residents of these neighborhoods are largely African American and Latino. And these are also the neighborhoods in which policing has been concentrated. And there's a sense of estrangement and alienation and just plain old distrust of not just police, but of government more broadly. And this is what makes the question that we're asking here so urgent. Can safety only be obtained by the police? Or are there other means that are organic and durable that come directly from neighborhoods, that employ how we arrange our physical space, that consider that safety is made up not just of crime reduction, but of work and play and employment? So that's what we'll talk about tonight. But first, we have a 4-minute movie that highlights some of the things that are afoot in our city today. And I just wanted to say, give a credit to Jeremy Robbins and his team from Echoes of Incarceration, which is a documentary initiative that's produced by youth with incarcerated parents. And now I'm supposed to say these magic words, which is cue the video, and then magical.
There's a web of systems that are interconnected that all impact this public safety.
And public safety is not just the absence of crime, but it's the presence of so much.
It's about putting money into the communities, not necessarily taking police out, but it's making sure that community and police can co-produce public safety.
So while New York City is experiencing historic drops in crime, there were neighborhoods that had historically been underinvested in. And so the approach that we're taking really looks at that disinvestment.
We really focus on creating safe, empowered, and interconnected communities.
The NCO stands for Neighborhood Coordination Officer. We just come out here and just interact with all the community people.
When you're on patrol, you're just going from job to job, you're attached to the radio. Now as an NCO, you have time to interact with the community more and focus on people that need more attention.
There's countless hours that we're in people's homes, going into meetings, listening to that individual that might have a big problem, or the smallest problem.
When we first started, people wouldn't come up to the car. Now they'll talk to us and people will be like, oh, it's just Officer B and Officer P.
The patrol cops here tell me when they even respond to jobs that they feel more welcome when they go inside the apartments. And that's something very impactful, that the department has finally listened to the community and is doing those changes.
Losing a life is never easy. Today, my mother has to bury her son, and a young man is going to grow up without a father.
So 696 Bill Queensbridge is a cure violence site, part of the crisis management system in New York City. Knowing that violence is something that's replicated, that violence works similar to a communicable disease, that we have an opportunity when this happens to change that pattern.
People who stop and think don't pull triggers. People who stop and think pull minds.
When you have credible messengers, maybe sometimes they're known for things that weren't so positive in the past, but they are influential, they have charisma. When these people put that power in a place with a purpose, the result is we can change the culture and the norms in communities.
So what happens if you get in trouble in this area is your cases are arraigned downtown, but you're sent back to the Justice Center for programs and services. And the first thing is we want you to resolve your mandate. But after you resolve your mandate, we want to link you to a voluntary program.
They let us know what they're interested in. Is it entrepreneurship? Is it music? Is it fashion? Is it technology? And we've had plazas that have developed throughout the neighborhood, murals that have gone up.
And I think what we're trying to think about criminal justice is really this idea around mobility out of poverty. We believe once you have something to lose, you make much better decisions.
When people feel self-worth, self-pride in their own community, they feel more invested in their community and want to do more positive things in there.
Since being here in Brownsville, our recidivism is below 10%. So not only are they resolving their court cases, but young people are not getting arrested again. If anything, they are really part of the community change.
What the mayor found when he took office was that there were 15 developments that were really driving crime in public housing. The first phase was we started making physical infrastructure improvements that you could see right away. And so we did listening tours with the residents to understand what would be some solutions that you feel like we should be doing. And active public spaces was a critical component. So feeling that community centers are open late, there are urban gardens and farms, aerobics classes happening, really looking at how do we activate public spaces, because we know that vibrant public spaces are safer spaces.
One of the reasons why we focus on design is because the way in which public spaces are designed really has an impact on the way people feel about themselves, the way they connect with each other.
Since the initiative started, shootings are down by 24%. That's outpacing the rest of public housing. And we're also investing in people, the places, and the networks that run through those places. The police have a certain set of tools to address a problem. When you broaden the group of people in that room, each are going to bring a different tool from their toolbox and collaboratively be able to solve it.
I look at this as how do we transform government practices and really bring in the people that are most impacted to bring the solutions to community.
Because at the end of the day, all we want is a safer neighborhood. We can't just arrest our way out of these issues. We have to be more creative and smarter about our initiatives.
More creative and smarter about our initiatives.
Okay, and now to the main event. So you have the full bios in your program, so I'm just going to briefly introduce the people who will be on the panel. First, my colleague, Eric Cumberbatch. He's the founding director of the Office to Prevent Gun Violence, and every day Eric and his team are working in the neighborhoods across the city to really create a new model of safety that's centered in and owned by New Yorkers in each neighborhood. And he's federated over 20 neighborhood organizations who use a whole bunch of techniques that I think you'll talk about in order to create peace. Pat Sharkey is the chair of NYU's Sociology Department and one of the nation's foremost thinkers and writers about violence, inequality, and place, and most recently wrote a terrific book. I'm doing a lot of selling tonight. A really great book called An Uneasy Peace, in which he looks at the history and intertwining of violence and inequality. Eric Klinenberg is the director of the Institute of Public Knowledge, and he's written broadly on an array of topics, and most relevant to our discussion today, has a forthcoming book called Palaces for the People, and in it he discusses how social infrastructure, shared places like parks and libraries and churches can help fight increasing inequality and polarization. And we also have a moderator. David Remnick, our moderator, is the editor of The New Yorker and an extraordinary polymath. His trenchant insights and lyrical writing keep us honest on everything from politics to literature and gives us a peek behind the curtain on topics as diverse as Lou Reed, Muhammad Ali, and Russian oligarchs.
And you have to figure out who's which is which. I'd like to start, before we get into a discussion of the absolute present and the future, and where even improvements can be made, I want to get a sense of, maybe you have a differing sense of the recent past. Every discussion of crime in New York always sketches the dismal landscapes and statistics of the 70s and the 80s, the graffiti, the murder numbers, and all the rest. And then the increasingly promising trends, or really amazing trends, that have brought us to where we are now. I'd like to know, how do you frame the general history of where we are now, of how we got to where we are now? How do you look at particularly at the very famous article in 1982, it was published in the Atlantic Monthly, a rival magazine, I should say, called Broken Windows, which seemed to spark a rethinking of all of these questions. So maybe we'll start with Patrick and we'll work our way through.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for putting this together, Liz and Sherry for hosting it. Yeah, so that's a big picture question about how we got here. What I think happened, I argue that we have to think about the changes that took place in New York and elsewhere all across the country a little bit more broadly and think about them really as a set of changes that really transform the nature of public space. And these changes started in the 1990s, and in the 1990s there was actually a crisis of violence, and that had been brewing for a long time, but that was had reached its peak in the early 1990s when, as Liz mentioned, there were 2,200 and more homicides per year in New York, but the nation as a whole, the homicide rate was up around 10 for every 100,000 people. At that time, there's a Gallup poll that asked the most pressing problem facing the nation. That's been asked, the question's been asked since 1930. Well, in 1994, for the first time in the history of that poll, crime and violence was the top answer given. So this was a national crisis that provoked a national response. The response to that came in the form of a new investment in policing, new tactics, including broken window or zero tolerance or order maintenance policing, whatever you want to call it, a continued expansion of incarceration, and then a whole set of additional changes, like crackdown on gang activity, on open-air drug markets that we saw in New York. So that part is well known. I think there was another set of changes that is not as well known and that's relevant for today's discussion, which is that there was a large-scale mobilization of residents in organizations hit hardest by violence. And we can actually see this in the numbers of just community groups, nonprofits. We now have data on every nonprofit that's formed. And in the 1990s, there was this explosion, this proliferation of nonprofit organizations in communities hit hardest by violent crime, focusing particularly on how to build stronger neighborhoods, how to confront the problem of violence. So that's been left out of the discussion, but I think that mobilization is just as important as the expansion of the police forces and new tactics of policing. This set of changes transform public spaces, and all of these changes together, in my mind, that's what brought about the decline of violence. Some of these changes were positive, some were negative, some had unanticipated consequences, like mass incarceration. But if we want to think about how we got to this point, I think we have to consider all of these changes, and that's the best explanation that I can come up with about why violence fell.
Eric, you want to talk about some of those groups that Patrick was referring to?
Absolutely. I really want to start from the core question. I look at myself as an example, and I look at the child I was makes me the man I am today. And growing up in the 80s and 90s and the experiences that I've faced and families have faced and other people in neighborhoods alike, I believe that's why we are where we are today, that there's people in community that are vested and want to see healthy and vibrant spaces, and they've dedicated their lives to doing just that.
Eric, where'd you grow up, and give us the scene?
Sure, I was born in the Beach 40s in Rockaway Public Housing, bounced around the city, all 5 boroughs. My father struggled with addiction, and we moved around a lot. I want to say I touched probably 20 different spaces before I was 18. And in doing that, just really learning and being part of just every space in New York City. So I've really seen the mobilization and the efforts from community to be the ones that create the change that they want to see. And in this role here, really continuing to empower individuals to sustain what that change actually looks like. So, you know, I think the real point towards public safety is it starts from the community. And
What does the phrase broken windows mean to you? What kind of resonance does that have?
I look at the application of broken windows. So if you only have enforcement-based response, then you exacerbate the problem. But if you're empowering community members and you're working with all government actors and agencies to have a more human approach towards resolution, then I think we start to see conditions of quality of life change for the better.
Eric?
Well, you know, you're going to think that I'm just kind of playing to the moderator here, but I want to start by saying something about this Atlantic article, which has some real issues. And
rip it to shreds.
So here's the thing. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to come up with a magazine article that has been more influential in the realm of urban policy, criminal justice policy, than this piece, Broken Windows. I mean, it is an extraordinary thing. And when you look closely at the article, many surprising things appear.
Well, maybe for some of the students here, maybe just who are maybe on the younger side, just maybe summarize the article and where it was
good idea.
Just terrible that never made it in the New Yorker.
I'm always a little afraid to summarize anything having to do with crime and justice in front of Pat Sharkey, my colleague, because basically everything I know I learned from reading his books. Yeah. But I'm going to try it anyway at risk of humiliating myself. And the kind of basic story with...
Well, you both have tenure, so don't worry
I can say anything I want to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'll know which of our courses you should take at the end of the session. Yeah. So the basic story with Broken Windows is the idea that if you have a community that has physical signs of disorder, most notably broken windows, that signals to other people who are there that no one is minding the shop. You can do what you want to do because this is a place that can't exert sufficient social control over the local environment to manage itself. And therefore, if you're potentially interested in getting involved in crime, you know that that's a place to do it. And once the broken window hits and no one cleans it up and someone comes and commits a crime, you get this vicious cycle. That's the basic thesis. Is that good, Professor Sharkey?
Well done.
All right. So with that said,
A+.
Here's the amazing thing about this article, which again, I mean, as a scholar, I want to say one thing that's incredible is we will spend our lives trying to get these very kind of precise works through the peer review process to make sure that we all agree on it and it's methodologically sound and logically rigorous. And this is a piece that's in a magazine. And when I went back to look closely, and I say that as someone who loves to write magazine articles and to read them even more, so I get the appeal. But when I was going back to look at this story, for working on this book that's coming out, I noticed a really funny thing, and that is that their account of how you get to the broken window situation starts like this. A neighborhood gets abandoned, and so you have abandoned homes and empty lots, weeds grow, windows are broken. So it's this chain of 3 events. You start with the abandonment, the empty lots, then the weeds grow, then the broken windows go. Now, Abandoned Lots is a terrible magazine title. I think that's right.
I think that's true.
Weeds Grow, probably also not good. Broken Windows, you can hang a theory on that. And I'll tell you that one of the arguments I make in this book is that I think one reason that we got so focused on the signs of disorder like broken windows and then started to police disorder that were criminal acts of disorder, breaking a window, is because that concept resonated so well. You're not going to believe me that kind of concepts that resonate well, even if they're not true, can play well in politics, I know. But so what I think is that we've actually missed something totally fundamental in the story, which is part of what made certain urban neighborhoods so dangerous and vulnerable was the abandonment, was the depletion of the physical infrastructure, much more so, I would say, than the broken windows themselves. And if we had followed that, a whole different series of policies might have gone into play.
What's amazing to me is that this was not unique to New York. And it's not even unique to the United States. Crime rates, violent crime rates, plunged all over the world, in London and in many other cities abroad as well. What was happening, what were some of the, and before we start zeroing in on New York, which we absolutely will do, what was happening all around the world that caused this to happen? Maybe Patrick, take a shot.
Yeah, so there have been the changes that have taken place. First of all, they took place in cities all over the U.S., which is, to different degrees, but and New York had among the sharpest drops. But there were lots of cities: L.A., D.C., San Francisco. These cities transformed entirely. But then you're exactly right that a lot of developed countries. Canada had a very similar crime drop as the U.S. No increase in incarceration, similar crime drop. A lot of countries, developed countries that look similar to the U.S. in a lot of ways, also experienced a crime drop. Now, I don't think we should overstate the commonalities because they occurred at different times and to very different degrees and probably had a lot of different explanations. That said, some of the advances that have taken place just in security technology are very similar, and they've happened across the world. If you think about this idea that public space transformed, part of that was through policy and through enhanced policing, enhanced oversight, surveillance. Part of that just became possible through camera technology, through like LoJack ended motor vehicle theft in the U.S. It was a new technology, not because everybody put a LoJack on their car, but because in the places where they did, the guys who would steal cars and bring them back to the chop shop couldn't do that anymore because once they got the wrong car, then their whole operation was done. So the idea is that technology played a role in the transformation of public space, which was not unique to the U.S.
Now we come to a painful subject. If you were to read James Baldwin's essays about the relationship between the community, Harlem in particular, and the police in the early 60s, there was a ferocity of mistrust between the community and the police, which felt, in Baldwin's terms, like an invading or occupying force. If you were to listen to some of the conversations to this day with radically less crime, the mistrust persists in a very, very serious way. I think it's fair to say. Why have the statistics made so little difference in the sense of trust between community and police?
I would start with...
Or is the premise wrong?
No, you're spot on, but I would start with a historical sense of being traumatized, and that trauma being felt across generations. I wouldn't say it started with police in the 60s, and that this predates the formal establishment of law enforcement departments in the United States. And atrocities have been carried out across police departments along those generations. So the trauma, the mistrust, the hurt, a lot of those things have never been addressed. And there's very little truth and reconciliation on that topic. Even the acknowledgement that it exists, and the steps that are truly transparent and collectively building to transform.
Is it possible that our understanding is lagging behind the crime statistics? In other words, the discussion of mass incarceration, for example, whether it's Michelle Alexander's book or many other conversations about this, scholarly works on this, community works on this, kind of lags behind the explosion in incarceration. So just as incarceration rates, I'm not for a second suggesting they're radically better, but are coming down a bit. Certainly in this city they're down a good bit, but nationally they're a national shame with the rates that they're at. How do we do better? In other words, when you talk about truth and reconciliation, that's a phrase that comes out of the South African experience and other countries around the world which have had up and down experiences on the success, whether it's in Czech Republic or Pretoria. How do we go about this process? You're somebody that is working from the ground up.
Right. So I don't believe in policing in the traditional sense. And I really feel like, as opposed to law enforcement, you should be somewhat of a guardian of public safety. And that's a very different field for community. So
explain what that means specifically.
Well, instead of imposing will or being more of a paternalistic power in a community, you're seen more so as a partner. And a partner values all of the members of a particular area, of a particular neighborhood. And the power dynamic becomes, we're on the same level, we're on the same plane.
So what would the police look like in your view? Or what should policing look like? Would they be armed? Would there be, we hear a lot about, there's a term that's used, I'm sure you all talk about this quite a bit, about abolition. Not just in an ideal sense, but in moving forward, what role is there for the police?
I would say there's a role for public safety officers in community, and there's a larger role for community to be empowered to govern.
You're deliberately not using the word police, so what does that mean?
I'm not avoiding the word police. I feel that there's a historical trauma with police, the terminology. And it's very difficult to go into community and brand or try to rebrand with the old past. And you're holding on to the same name, the same look, and the same approach. And I think all of those things need to be unpacked, blown up. I like to think that's what me and my team represent in the criminal justice space.
So take that another beat. Beyond the general, what would that give us at least a taste or what that means specifically on the ground, what you'd like to see?
I would like to see community groups like those in East New York, Man Ups, the life camps in Southeast Queens, the SOS teams in the Bronx to really be invested in at the same levels of what current law enforcement looks like. And when we mobilize an entire community at the exact rates of law enforcement, and I'm talking not just financially, I'm talking in terms of sheer numbers, to have community members that are vested in controlling their neighborhoods. I think that's never occurred, and the strength there would be beyond incredible.
You're particularly interested in the effect of public spaces and the look and feel of those public spaces on public safety.
Yeah.
In your next book, you've got a chapter that Lizzie was good enough to send me the other night, and it'll be out soon. It's about what happened in Philadelphia. Tell me about that experience, because it involves a community organization that sounds very white glove, and almost like, you know, like there's going to be a luncheon at the library or something. And in fact, it's really extremely gritty and effective.
Yeah, it's the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, in case you're looking for a lunch invitation.
You can almost see the
soon.
Centerpieces at the lunches.
They would be amazing.
Yeah.
Well, this really resonated with me as someone who grew up in Chicago, because Philadelphia ecologically has a lot in common with Chicago insofar as it's a place that has had substantial population loss over the last several decades, and so the physical landscape looks a lot different than, you know, surely Manhattan and most parts of Brooklyn and Queens, where you're seeing this kind of a lot of investment. Maybe there are parts of the Bronx that look like it, but in Philadelphia, there are tens of thousands of empty lots and abandoned houses, and of course they're concentrated in poor and segregated, largely African American neighborhoods. And there were people in the communities who thought for years, based on their experiences, that having a place like that on the block made the block more dangerous. It's just their impression that if you were dealing drugs, there's not much better that you could do than finding an abandoned house that no one is looking after, or an empty lot adjacent to it. And that had been kind of a lay theory that you found in the neighborhoods. And there's an epidemiologist who at the time was at Penn, and he's now at Columbia, named Charles Brannis. And he got interested in actually studying this. He was thinking about how to do something empirical and experimental, and he was at a conference with the Pennsylvania horticulturalists, and they made a presentation on this pet project they had. They started going around into neighborhoods where they were getting complaints and making very inexpensive interventions into the physical landscape. And that could mean if it's an abandoned lot, and picture an empty lot with 8, 10, 12-foot high weeds, lots of garbage, and these are substantial lots. And if you haven't seen what that looks like, you should go to Philadelphia or some other city and see them. I mean, they're really extraordinary places. And they were spending a few $100 and just kind of shaving down the green stuff that's there, and then spending a few $100 more and putting a little wooden fence around it, in some places putting a bench, creating something like either a protected and clean manicured area or a pocket park in its more exalted form. And they had another little project they were doing, which is they were just securing the abandoned buildings so that people couldn't go in and out of them, putting on a solid door and locking it and boarding up the windows so you couldn't get in. And Brannis realized, as he was listening to this presentation, that there's a kind of natural experiment that you could run. And you could, in fact, work with this horticultural society to scale up their initiative and to do more of them in some places and not in others. So they did this randomly controlled trial. They made this intervention in some blocks, but not in others. And the results of this study, which they've done now for more than a decade, are staggering. They found that for very modest interventions in the physical landscape, you could dramatically, statistically significantly reduce the amount of gun violence around an abandoned building, and of other forms of violent crime around empty lots as well. And so the results are robust. They hold over time, and what's incredible about them is that they're scalable, so that they don't just work in one part of Western Philadelphia. They could work theoretically anywhere. And this, for me, is kind of one of the most exciting experiments that we have in the social sciences now. And what's amazing as someone who kind of works in this area is how little people know about this work. And so it's one of many studies that show just how powerfully we can shape the context for crime.
So, thank you. And so I imagine those abandoned buildings and those lots actually being transformed and turned over to the community. So not just for the aesthetic appearance, but the ability to link people to services, resources, create these types of community hubs and networks that really can serve as support systems from community by community. So the same way we can very intentionally point out these areas of distress and disorder in the community, we have the capacity, capability, and infrastructure to build this from within.
I want to ask you all about optimism and pessimism. If you listen to the statistics that Lizzie was providing, Elizabeth Glazer was providing, and others, when we read about crime rates in New York City, there's every reason to be, especially if you've been alive for a little while, pretty optimistic. And so you want to know how much lower can it go. Economists, when they talk about unemployment rates, when they get to a certain point, when it's low enough, they start talking about that's what full employment is. How low is the floor on violent crime? And at the same time, if you look at, well, the overall statistic for African American men between the ages of 18 and 34, that's the highest reason for death in African American men. To this day, homicide. So that's not so wonderful, God knows. And then if you look at large sectors of the south and west side of Chicago, parts of St. Louis, Baltimore, they don't have any gardens.
Yeah.
Their statistics are horrible. So, and I worry about, maybe you join me in this, the kind of Steven Pinker phenomenon. Steven Pinker, scholar at Harvard who examines the 20th century and into the 21st century and kind of looks at all the worldwide statistics and basically is trying to indicate that even though wars are on our television screen every day, it's only because they're on our television screen that make us crazy and make us feel horrible. But in fact, you know, certainly since the 50s, the rate of people being killed in war has plummeted. So he's very cheerful. Are you also cheerful about when it comes to crime rates and urban crime rates?
I'll say on this, the first job I had out of college was a job in drug policy, and I stopped doing it and didn't want to make a career because it seemed to me like the science was so obvious here. We have this incredibly volatile and dangerous situation that we've remained committed to in our policymaking, and that is we have prohibited many illegal drugs that potentially could be regulated in a far more safe way. We have allowed, while we have prohibited drugs, we have allowed Americans to have handguns and to get fairly easy access to them. And third, we have this history that you referred to of tension with the police and with African Americans and with low-income.
Of institutionalized racism.
That's right, to put it more clearly. And those three things, as long as we have those three things, we will have a level of violent crime that
We also have
exceeds-
another element. We have politics. We have politics. We live in a world of politics. And in the last inaugural address, I didn't hear the President of the United States talk about plummeting crime rates in racial comedy. I heard a new President of the United States talking about apocalyptic visions of our urban landscapes, fear of immigrants, not a hand extended, but rather a wall being built. And this has had an effect, how, Patrick, on our on this effort?
I think it's still not entirely clear, but I think all right, this is not working so well. So to have this discussion, I think we have to deal with a fundamental problem that we faced since the 1960s, which is how to deal with the problem of urban inequality and urban poverty. And in that decade, there was a model that focused on investment, that focused on justice and restitution, that is crystallized in the Kerner Commission report published in 1965. That model was scrapped. That model was very important, led to major civil rights advances, led to major investments in the war on poverty. It was scrapped. An alternative model was adopted. The alternative model saw the growing urban crisis as a function of lawlessness and disorder, and then developed a model of abandonment and punishment, being the solutions to urban inequality. Okay, that model was implemented in the Nixon administration. It hasn't gone away. It's remained largely intact in the decades since. And I think we have to deal with that fundamental issue, that our model dealing with urban inequality rests on a dual strategy of abandonment, leaving cities on their own, and punishment, relying heavily on the police and the prison system. Now, over the past, I'd say 7 or 8 years, but really culminating in 2014, 2015, that model began to break down. People who had no experience with police brutality saw it on their cell phone cameras. They watched what happened to Eric Garner. And so this became real. At the same time, the level of violence had fallen to a point where most people across the country are not worried about crime and violence on a day-to-day basis.
And had the statistics on police violence against citizens, particularly African American men, but against citizens, gone up or down, or was it our ability to see it square?
It's our ability to see it, and it looks more and more out of place, given that I looked at, the FBI produces these supplemental homicide reports, which show every homicide and the cause of it. I looked at every form of homicide over time, and they all show the same pattern. Okay, they've all dropped by about half since the early 1990s. The exception is justifiable homicides, which are the code for police shooting a criminal,
and the
or perceived
on
criminal, which has fluctuated a little bit, but has been flat since the early 90s, basically flat, and may have risen since 2013. And those data are terrible. That's the one that we measure worse because police departments report it. They report all of them, but that one is not measured well. We now have evidence that there are many more of those police shootings than are reported in the FBI data. So it looks more and more out of place. More and more people see it, and that old model of relying on the police and the prison has broken down. So the biggest question right now is, what's the next model? Given that police are no longer able to dominate public space, that's no longer tolerable, that's no longer seen as sustainable. What's the next model? And I think where we've seen the divergence since 2014 is how cities have adapted. What kinds of how cities have changed the way that they try to deal with violence.
So how is that conversation going to happen? Because if you're in the real world of politics, not here at a conference at the Puck Building in Manhattan, but in the real world of politics, and you start discussing the displacement of police by community groups, or if you start talking the way you do, I don't know how far you get. In the real world of politics, as logical as what you're saying and as decent as what you're saying sounds to me, to my ears, and I think to a lot of ears here, how does this begin to enter the realm of politics?
Stetler, you want to go?
Go ahead.
Sure. So before I answer that, I just want to go back to the 18 to 34 piece, if I can. I think we also can't hide the fact that when we talk about trajectory for young black males, that the population or society that we're in fear black males. And with that fear comes a huge downward spiral. And when I say that fear...
Of what kind?
Well, I'm not just talking about law enforcement, I'm talking about everyday people that are in this audience, where if I was to be in a room with you alone or in an elevator with you alone, I could sense your fear, I know your fear, I see your fear. So that's a real piece. So we're talking about our teachers, our doctors, people that we interact with every day are already prejudging an individual from birth. So there's this inherent fear, and you compound that with disinvestment, you compound that with identity, not being able to control your own identity as it's produced to the public. You're creating a recipe for disaster. And then when that recipe for disaster starts to play out, it's to point the finger and say, you know, what's happening with this population? And I would ask, what's not happening? What should be happening to this population? What does real empowerment look like? What does investment look like? How do we get to a space of talking about equity? What does that look like, and what does that feel? So, I just didn't want that to leave the room.
Fair enough.
In terms of police, I believe public safety is co-produced. So, when we talk about bolstering and empowering, mobilizing community-based organizations that are trained professionals, people from community, that have experienced a lot of the causes or root causes that some of these young people are going through today, that doesn't mean to remove police. What that means is to support these groups so they have greater reach and touch. So if an NYPD is doing precision policing, we can be doing precision community engagement. And we can be identifying...
In concert.
In concert. And we can be identifying families through prenatal care, families in schools, families on the streets, so forth. We could be at every touch point where there's young people that have risk factors in their lives to lift them up. And I believe there's been a network that has been torn apart in communities of color. And in several or various communities, individuals have the opportunity to fail and fall, and you're caught and you're lifted right back up. You're lifted right back up and you're propelled forward. In communities of color, you fail, you fall, you continue a downward spiral.
And part of that picture is the incarceration picture.
Absolutely. The fracturing of families over generations.
So, but just to say one thing about, on your question about the real politics of criminal justice, I actually think there is a little bit more space for change than you allowed initially. So the reason is that before the Trump election, there really was this strong and surprising push, Pat, I don't know if you thought it was surprising, where you had the Koch brothers, you had a number of Republican senators and national leaders, candidates for the presidency, who were changing their position.
Newt Gingrich was another.
On policing and mass incarceration.
Although they would never mention race.
Fair enough, and I think there's some battles are going to be with us for a long time to come,
right.
And that one also. But it's extraordinary, this change from the right on incarceration. One reason that this kind of distrust and cynicism about policing remains, even despite the drop in crime, is because for years, and still I think in many cities, the arrest rates have stayed high even while the crime rates have gone down. Stop and frisk, the kind of response to broken windows policing was driving that. Mm-hmm. So we had a division that was born of policy, but we also had, I think, the beginning of a real reckoning nationally with this notion that mass incarceration was not sustainable. And so what's so disturbing, one of many things that's so disturbing about this president and this administration, is the shift to this increasingly divisive and punitive rhetoric that's a throwback to another era. And so, I don't know where this debate is going to go, but I suspect that after the Trump presidency, whenever that is, this debate about criminal justice policy could get more interesting again. Pat, do you think that's a crazy idea?
No, I think that's right. But there's a problem. There's a caveat.
Just one problem.
So the movement for criminal justice reform, which I agree entirely with Eric's diagnosis. This was actually, there have been activists on the left who have been pushing for this for a long time. The movement has come because of activists on the right. So it has come not primarily for the cause of justice, but it has come for the cause of austerity. That has been the biggest driver of the conservatives have come to see the criminal justice system as an enormous arm of the government, equivalent to entitlements as overreach, excessive, and too expensive. And that's where a lot of the change has come from. So the issue in my mind is if we think about kind of the response to urban inequality and violent crime and all of the problems that come with it as either abandonment and punishment or investment, restitution, justice, there has been movement away from punishment and toward justice. And I think that's very real, and I think we could see that after this administration. Think we can see that return. But there has not been movement from abandonment and toward investment. And so really when I hear Eric talking about what community residents and organizations need to co-produce safe communities, to build stronger communities, which is really what we're talking about here, the commitment in resources, in investment that has always been given to the criminal justice system has never been given to the organizations and the residents who have the greatest capacity to control violence. They've never had that commitment. If they had that commitment, I think there's actually, it's not just that this is how we want the world to work, it's that there's really good evidence that they can play the strongest role in confronting violence.
Now, I have a cheap moderator's trick, which is to say this. First, there should be questions being collected on old-fashioned cards. You have some of those? While you're doing that, does anybody want to add to the stack? I have a question I'd like you all to answer, and then we'll get questions from the audience and even from the magic iPad, which I think people are possibly sending in questions from, as they used to say, all around this great nation of ours. If you had one thing that you could impress upon those very close friends, Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, or in another lifetime a President of the United States, that would be the most significant step forward in what we were discussing, what would it be? Whether it's an expenditure or a policy change that would, in your view, help drive down the rate of crime even further and keep it there.
So I want to say something about these physical spaces I've written about, but instead, I think what would really do it is changing our drug laws so that we have more sane and reasonable and less punitive drug laws.
How so? What would we do?
Well, for instance, we have still not had a full reckoning on marijuana, and we know from this great research by former NYU sociology grad student and now Yale law professor Isa Kohler-Hausman results in, is it hundreds of thousands of marijuana arrests in New York City? And Lizzie's saying, no, it's not. It's some extraordinary number, it used to be, some extraordinary number of misdemeanor charges against primarily young people of color who get enrolled into the criminal justice system, who have a stigma and a mark that makes their lives more difficult from then on, because it makes it more difficult for them to get work, because it means if they get picked up on some random stop for something light, an officer sees that they have a record, it makes them more distrustful of mainstream institutions and makes it all the more likely that they will be involved in something less savory. And so if we want to really reckon with this unconscionably high rate of incarceration and arrests, I think there's no better way to do it than to come up with a more sane drug policy.
Okay.
So I would start by saying there isn't one magic thing that we could do. This is like walking into a cobweb, spider webs, and you're trying to remove one, but you have 100 other pieces still on you. So I would leave it there. What I would recommend is that people in positions of policy and procedural change, that should reflect the people in the communities that we're discussing and talking about. And those people should be in the leadership positions alongside those who may have more formal institutional or academia expertise and guide that process jointly. And that in itself will lend towards fairness and healthier communities as a start. But I think we could have a whole panel on that question.
That's fair. I did say it was a cheap moderator trick.
So the first thing I'd say is, and this is not just kissing ass because Liz Glazer is in the room. New York is actually a proof of concept for the country about how to adapt to a new model of policing and a new model of trying to build relationships between residents and the police department. It truly is. New York is the place where incarceration has fallen, where the police department has made an explicit attempt through neighborhood coordination officers, through neighborhood staff, which Liz dreamed up, which puts residents and community leaders in the same room with police officers and neighborhood coordination officers to diagnose the problems in the neighborhood beyond crime. Where is garbage piling up? Where are doors unlocked in a housing development? To try to build stronger neighborhoods in an explicit way that brings together community residents and police officers. And the fact that violence has continued to fall in New York is crucially important because there's a lot of skepticism that a new model of policing will actually work. New York City so far is the proof of concept that it can work. To answer your question about what investments are needed, I mean, in the green room, I called Eric C. the most important person in New York City. I think it's right. I think what he does in terms of working with organizations to try and create stronger neighborhoods by bringing people together and that only happens if organizations are strong, if institutions are strong. So that drives from investment.
Well, on that score, can I ask Eric to be very specific about that, because not everybody in the room is intimately familiar with your specific activity. Give an example in the neighborhood, on the street, of what you're doing that is having real results.
So I would use the 6-7 precinct public safety coalition last summer. The 6-7 precinct East Flatbush led New York City in shooting incidents probably for the last 3 years. What we did was, instead of helicoptering into a community and saying, this is what's wrong, this is how you fix it, and we're going to tell you and move these pieces, we really looked at what are all the assets and strengths of this community, how do we hotwire them together, and then how do we amplify all of their efforts, investing in community members financially, so investing by supplying data, resources, tools, whatever was needed. And this coalition, for the first time, I want to say between July and September, was able to bring down the shooting incidents in East Flatbush almost by 50% over that time frame, year to date.
How did it work in parallel with, in communication with, or was it like parallel play in the playground? It wasn't with law enforcement.
Yeah, it wasn't. I always say the relationship is, we don't have to be champions of each other's work or institutions, but as leaders, we coexist in a community. So
it wasn't hostile, though?
It wasn't hostile. And I don't think we want to have hostile relationships with law enforcement as it stands. We want to be well respected and embraced. And
is that ever a problem?
There's always problems in New York.
What are they?
I would say NYPD has come a long way with embracing community members in doing this work, and vice versa. Community members have seen where NYPD can be extremely useful in mitigating levels of distress and disorder in community. So
you say they've come a long way. Was there real difficulty in the beginning?
It wasn't as warm as it is now.
You're good.
I have to keep these relationships alive.
Well, we're talking about history, though. Was it condescending? Was it hostile? Was it? What were the difficulties of getting started?
It wasn't condescending. I think it was branding what community looks like, what community feels like, and the capacity that community-based organizations have. When we're talking about crime numbers that are so low, I think PD also realizes that they can't get to that granular level. And if I have community-based organizations that know the child, know the mother, the parents, so forth, it's greater entry points, greater access points, and we can get to individuals before there's a need for any enforcement action.
There's a question here on saying, if policing is not the model, what replaces it? We're elaborating on something we raised before. How does this then intersect with politics in the real world? This is coming from Twitter.
So first off, I think the police are crucial. I think, as Eric has talked about, we desperately need the police as the fundamental institution designed to preserve social order and confront violence. We're arguing for a new model where the police are working closely with residents instead of working against residents, combined with a new form of precision policing that we haven't talked much about, but I think that is fundamental to this conversation. So I saw a different model in Western Australia. I've been researching this question and trying to find models, trying to find alternative ways that community residents have generated informal social control over their communities without the byproducts of intensive or brutal or aggressive policing or incarceration. The reason I went to Western Australia is because there's an indigenous population called the Noongar who are in that have had issues with local law enforcement that dwarf anything that has happened in New York City. I won't go into the details, but their history, the Noongar in Perth, Australia, is just shocking to read about. And what I saw was a group of residents who had funding from the government and were tasked with the goal of going out into their community, extremely well trained, compensated for what they do. Their value is not only recognized, but they are paid well. Okay, they are seen as professionals in their community. They go out into their community and they look for people who are in need of help. They look for kids who are maybe close to getting into a fight or an altercation. They look for homeless people who need medical assistance. The night that I was out with them, there was a woman at the end of the night who was in a wheelchair and was not comfortable going home. Okay, she did not feel safe going to her home. They found another place for her to go that night. The value of this was that it was a group of residents. Everyone on the staff is of Aboriginal descent. They are treated like professionals. They are respected both by law enforcement and by the residents. They make themselves a presence in public space, and I see it as an alternative security force, meaning their job is not to enforce the law. Their job is to make sure that everyone within their community is okay before they get picked up and put in jail. And so that I see is a general model. I could envision it in the United States, and I have to say, after a night there, and they have a track record of success, but after a night walking through what the most striking part of their job was how much they were appreciated by the community.
Maybe this extends on what you're saying. We're seeing a suburbanization of poverty in this country through gentrification, through all kinds of trends. Sometimes in American cities, the most disadvantaged part of that area is not in the center of the city any longer, it's in an immediate suburb. How does this affect the situation? We've been talking very much about New York City and cities along the way. Are there any differences when it comes to the suburbs?
I saw that in Chicago, because the south suburbs of Chicago are some of the poorest places in the United States. Suburbs like Harvey that have received a lot of the public housing residents who were forced out of their apartments when the city took them down, and other poor people who could no longer stay in the city. And there are a couple issues in these very poor suburbs. One is that that kind of physical infrastructure I've described before of depletion, the kind of the empty lots, the abandoned buildings, they are there too. And the lack of density, the lack of shared public spaces that draw people out into common areas where they can establish connections and establish safety or informal surveillance, Jane Jacobs' eyes on the streets, that's a real issue there. And then there's this other thing, which is that the community, those suburbs, don't have the kinds of tax base that cities have. And so their municipal services from schools on down are deficient, and that leads to an additional layer of problems. And so, Pat, when I heard you talk about these kind of community protectors in Western Australia, I thought about the American versions and whether they would work in places like the south suburbs, the suburbs in South Chicago. And it strikes me that one problem here is that we do have a history of community organizations coming together to patrol crime on their own, but they do it not in this kind of collaborative, let's protect one another kind of way, but in this like made-for-TV style, let's turn ourselves into the baddest cops on the street way. and they will arm themselves. They become the night patrol, trying to do the work that they think the police aren't doing. So it's hard to get out of that, isn't it?
Is New York ready for unarmed police?
Can I just jump back to your last question and then answer the unarmed piece? I want to say really quickly, New York City has a crisis management system that approaches addressing community conditions, violence from a very holistic mindset and approach, really looking at what are the gaps, the needs, and how to link people to appropriate resources, appropriate services, and be that mentor, model, and shepherd of getting young people to those spaces. We have seen, when in terms of looking at shooting incidents start to spread towards the outer boroughs, where we're seeing great upticks on North Shore, Staten Island, Northern Bronx, and so forth. So we're seeing population move, and obviously it's telling us poverty is directly aligned and tied to what this issue is. So we need to invest more. And when I speak of investment, it's not just financially, it's empowering. In terms of unarmed officers, was it? Anytime a gun is discharged, whether it's from someone committing a criminal act to a law enforcement officer discharging a weapon, fractures and does more harm in a community. And for us, what we really want to build towards and see is that no one has to, not one person has to pick up and or utilize a weapon or under any circumstance.
Maybe the better question is, how low can this go? In other words, if we have 300 murders a year of late, and it used to be a multiple of that, a large multiple of that, what is there, just as economists talk about full employment, with all the complications that brings, how much better can this situation get in New York City?
I don't think we've scratched the surface, because the investment is although large because it's new, is still very small when we talk about the overall public safety budget for New York City. So when we talk about how low can we can go a lot further, because we can be in all of the spaces where we know there's people living in a context of risk factors. And we can be in those spaces in a very proactive way and address issues and mitigate all of these adverse things before there's someone needing to use a weapon or wanting to use a weapon.
Patrick?
So when Ray Kelly left as police commissioner, and there started to be some shifts in policy about the role of the NYPD, and in particular the end or the sharp reduction in the use of stop, question, and frisk, there were huge skeptics and lots of people who thought crime was going to rise and that it was going to rise very quickly. The opposite has happened. The lesson from that is, well, there are a couple lessons. First, I'll never predict where crime is going to go, because that has proven to be an ill-advised thing to do. But the lesson is that there are no obvious predictions about, a shift in policy is going to lead to X response. Violence is an enormously complicated phenomenon, incredibly complicated. We have not figured it out. So some exogenous shock can hit us and transform the landscape very quickly. That said, there are a set of changes that have gone on that are very real. Investments in community organizations, investments in a new form of policing, investments in new programs like Neighborhood Stat, that to me are the most promising things happening across the country. I go out to other places and I talk about what's happening in New York City. So I never thought we'd get below 300 murders. When de Blasio came in, the hope was that we wouldn't see a spike in crime, and for a while in 2014, I was very worried when there was a spike in shootings around some developments. That didn't materialize. Right now, I think we can point to New York as a proof of concept for the country that these reforms and these investments have the capacity, if they're sustained, if they're reinforced, to really become the next model of how we deal with urban violence.
To close?
Well, I'm just curious if we know of the 300, are there some common stories there? Are there, the remaining homicides, are they, people who know each other? Are they people involved in the drug trade? Can we zero in that way?
I bet Liz knows about each single incident and what to deal with it.
That would be that's a fascinating.
And
way to
Eric
go
as
forward.
well, but we haven't dealt with the issue of domestic violence adequately.
Yeah.
I think long term there needs to be a strategy to further reduce the use of guns in New York. We had a model for a long time that relied on stop, question, and frisk to get rid of guns on the street. It wasn't efficient, but that was the dominant model. I think the model has shifted there, and so the person who knows, what each incident, how to deal with each remaining incident is sitting next to me.
Well, I don't know each incident, but we do receive, and this goes back to the relationship with NYPD, so we do receive every shooting incident in New York City in real time. We blast that information out to a network of partners across the city so they can have the community's mobilization response on preventing retaliation and helping those that were adversely impacted start a healing process and work on what does cultural and behavior change look like in that area. In terms of the incidents, we receive very general or basic overview of what they assumed the scenario was at that point. And I want to say on a monthly basis from our research team, we're able to look at shooting incidents that are tied to gang or crew, petty disputes, those types of things, DV and so forth. So we do, look at what is actually happening and where the touch points are that we need to insert ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you all. I want to thank our panelists, thank Lizzie, thank everybody for having us here.
Thank you. Thanks, man. Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.